Managing Midlife. I am your host, Dr. Patty, and we are here tonight with our featured guest, which I'm very, very excited about, Peder Zane. He is the author of the book Off the Books on Literature and Culture. And I'm really pleased that he's taken time out of his busy schedule to be a part of our broadcast tonight and to talk about books and literature and how it has impacted our culture. Let me just give you a little bit of background information on Peder Zane. He is an American journalist who writes a bi-weekly column on politics and culture for the News and Observer of Raleigh. And he has won a number of national awards, to include the Distinguished Writing Award for Commentary from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And he is also a graduate with a master with honors from the Columbia University Graduate School, and he received his graduate degree in journalism. And he has had a very successful career in journalism and in writing and now teaching, and just a number of great things as he's making a dynamic contribution to the world at large. And so, Peder, I want to welcome you to our show tonight, and I just want to again thank you for taking the opportunity or taking the time to share, really just share with us a little bit about your book and the things that you've done in your career and what has motivated you to take on, first of all, this project and to share that with us. So let me first just stop there and allow you to just say your piece, and then we're going to move right into the interview.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patty, for having me. It's a real honor, and thank you for that extremely generous introduction. I feel journalism, being in this career, is sort of like being the last blacksmith. So I'm lucky that I sort of have been in this career in this time. I think journalism will continue. I hope newspapers do as well. And it's funny because then I have been in the world of books, and that itself has faced its own challenges, although it will endure. But I feel like I bring trouble to whatever I care about.
Well, you know what, I don't like to give all the juice away about the book because I want people to go out and purchase the book. But I'm telling you, you have to go and get this book because it is really a lot of not only great information and just looking back over certain key things that occurred in American history, from the civil rights movement up through the Bill Clinton scandal and Martha Stewart and so forth and so on. And I could just go on how many things Peder has covered over the course of many years now. But you know, one of the things that came to mind as I was reading through various excerpts of the book was the episode on the Twilight Zone, where the librarian is fired from his job and is going to be eliminated because he's no longer needed and books are obsolete. And as I read that, and let me just tell you, I'm going to take it from this excerpt because there's a chapter in the book that talks about, or a section that talks about anything goes. And in that, he has a column that was written about reading loses in this war. And I'm going to start there tonight because I want to read this portion that says, and I quote, "The less people read, the less equipped they become to understand and challenge the ideas shaping their world," close quote. And then the next session, which is the last paragraph, says, quote, perhaps it is time for a new war, one in which scholars and book lovers join forces not to promote specific books, but literature itself. There's no guarantee that reading will make us better people, but it will empower us to understand the world, especially the forces beyond our control. And I just want you to speak a little bit to that and share with us, you know, what prompted you just in writing this particular column, because that one is dated September 23rd, 2007. What was the drive or the mindset, or what was happening at the time that kind of brought that to the light or brought that to fruition?
So that column in part was a response to a series of reports that had come out that showed that Americans spend less and less time reading for pleasure. I think there had been an NEA report that had said that the average American doesn't even read one book a year for pleasure. So I was addressing that to one extent. The other was, let me just tell you my experience and how I came to be the book review editor. I had worked for years. I was basically a journalist covering news. I had covered school boards, zoning boards, I'd written cultural articles and so forth. And when I was offered the job at the News and Observer to be a book critic, I actually had never been a critic before. I was a journalist, and one of the important things that you do when you write is that you find an area of authority, find a way where you can be comfortable being who you are and writing what you know. And so when I got this job, not having been an English major, but a history major, not having worked as a scholar, but having been as a journalist, what I did was I approached the job of using books as sources for understanding the world around me. One of the things about journalism is that you never feel, as much as you feel like, oh, I want a crusading journalist, we hear about them all the time, you need a lot of humility as a journalist, because what you really do is provide information to other people to make up their own minds about things. The real journalists should not be people who are activists, who are pushing for causes. It doesn't mean you don't care about things, but it just means that your job, your function, and not everybody wants to do this, is to help other people become informed. So I come to this job as a book critic, as someone who's not trying to change the world, but is trying to understand the world. As someone who is using books, I'm not reviewing them as to just so much see whether or not the book succeeded or not on its own terms, but I'm reading it to make sense of the larger world around me. And so what I found from my own experience that I thought was really surprising to me is that when I became the book review editor, I had not really been reading a lot of books. I had been reading journalism, magazine, other things that were directly relevant to what I was writing about. As the book review editor, all of a sudden I'm reading much more fiction, memoirs, history. I'm reading works that are not directly relevant to the news events that are going on, to the cultural trends. And lo and behold, what I found was that ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the medieval period, the novels of Toni Morrison, Percival Everett, William Faulkner shed more light on what was going on around me than the directly relevant and topical things, because they allowed me to start to see what are the more universal forces going on underneath. What are the things, as much as things change, they stay the same. And they stay the same in part, and this is why literature can be timeless, because there are human drives, human desires. There are human ways of doing things that are illuminated in great books that often daily journalism doesn't have the time to address. And so what I was writing about in that column was my experience as somebody who had made much more time to read literature, to read history because of my job. And what I found was that it really helped me make much better sense of what was going on all around me than if I had just
Joining us. You are tuned into Managing Midlife with your host, Dr. Patty, and I am here tonight interviewing Peder Zane. He is the author of Off the Books on Literature and Culture. And we're having a very fruitful conversation this evening about his book and different excerpts from the book. So in the section, Peder, anything goes. Lack of curiosity is curious. And in this particular column, you talk about students, college students who may not, I think you used the example of a professor who was asking the students about a particular book or a particular writer, and they didn't know who the writer was, nor did they really care to know who the writer was of that particular book, which took you into a whole section that talked about the lack of curiosity and how it is having an impact, or you used the word infecting, our culture. And so the very last section of that particular column says, and I quote, "People are shaped by the world around them. In our here, now, get the job done environment of modern America, the knowledge for knowledge's sake ethos that is the foundation of a liberal arts education and of a rich and satisfying life has been shoved to the margins. Curiously, in a world where everything is worth knowing, nothing is." And I want to spin that into the conversation that we've been talking about, where books will make you better or make a person better. And even, going back to talking about reading and how people just aren't reading anymore. They just, don't have time, or don't want to know, or they're in the throes of life, or, whatever the case may be. And I just want you to speak a little bit more to it. Do you think that it's driven just by the lack of curiosity is because we're overwhelmed and overcome by life? Or is it just because of the advent of the technological world that we're in now, with the internet and social media and media driving everything? I mean, because this particular column was written back in 2005, so about 10 years ago, and we have just progressed so much now in the world in which we live in. I mean, even my children are on their iPhone doing homework and asking Siri for the answers to the homework questions. So,
right. Oh yeah. Well, I think that part of what's happened is there's a very positive and negative thing that's happened since the 1950s, 60s. There was a real assault on authority, which was very good, because we had a system in America, whether it had to do with civil rights, the treatment of women, the treatment of homosexuals, what was confining. All right. So we had a system, we basically had a revolution in this country where the authority was questioned. Okay. And that was a very positive thing. One of the things that happened was the authority of what one should know and not know, the idea of a canon. So to some extent, we always hear about, oh, we have to read dead white males. To a great extent, dead white males were the canon. Living white males decided that all the great writers had been dead white males, and these are the people you should read. So a very healthy assault on authority came about, a very healthy opening up of the canon, whether it's in music, literature, and so forth, to different types of artists and different literary forms occurred. Extremely good. The negative of that was it started to bring into question, what does anybody need to know? What are the things, when my father was growing up in the 1920s and 30s, there were things that cultured people knew. And in fact, that term is really important, because the whole idea of being cultured meant knowing certain things. Nowadays, culture is just whatever culture you happen to be in. It's all, there are different cultures and they're all equal. And it's no more important to read Tolstoy than it is comic books. They're all different art forms that have different messages and so forth. So the lack of curiosity, to some extent, what I was getting at there was this idea that we don't have any pressure in the society that we all should know certain things. And so there's a great freedom that we can all know whatever we want to know. But on the other hand, there's not that same kind of intense feeling that I had, for instance, when somebody told me, oh, you like music, you got it. John Coltrane was the greatest jazz saxophonist. I wanted to go out and hear John Coltrane. I felt like if people are telling me he's good, then I need to go out and listen to him. One of the things that you see in the classroom is a less of a sense that your teacher is somebody who knows things that you should know, and is more, convince me why I should need to know this. So the lack of curiosity, it's not that people don't know things anymore. Kids know lots of things, but they don't have the same desire to learn the things that other people have decided are what matter. That authority that has fallen apart. And there are a lot of advantages to it, but there are also disadvantages.
Absolutely. Which, you know, and I'm going to go a little bit off kilter now with this, because, you know, when you're talking about that, it's interesting because when we talk about traditions and we talk about values and we talk about things, I think you wrote a part probably in your introduction that talked about your dad and the appreciation for music and different things in the Italian culture and the things that he liked. And you know, just if you didn't know the answer to a question, you were absolutely mortified that you didn't know, and you were going to go and seek that information, you know, to find out. I think you talk about that in the book. But now here is the other thing that I want to really get to, and I'm going to veer away now, is the impact when you talk about traditions and you talk about culture, you know, through the media and through reading and through news, we have a whole wave of a revolution going on in American society and maybe around the world. You know, we've come through an era of civil rights. And we've come through an era of, you know, women's liberation. And I think you talk about certain groups, whether it be women, whether it be African Americans, whether it be gays, this wave now that is taking place in our society, and almost an upsurgence of these different groups that are now having a major impact on the way we think, on our terminology. You know, there's just a new advent of terminology that I had never even known before existed. The way it's affecting our children with gender identity and redefining gender now, religion, and the whole thing that's going on now in the media with, you know, gay marriage and voters' rights. I mean, these are all the things now. It's like, fast forward, how did we get to this place? Because you write about politics and culture. How did we get to this, like, this rumbling and now explosion of all of these things just coming out and now in the mass media, and people are really, really immersed into where they are, where they want to be. And now the children are actively involved in defining themselves and who they are. And we're just looking at it's a massive, it seems like, aggressive change in the world in which we live in, and how we see things and how we're viewing things these days. How is literature, how is reading, how are books affecting the way we think, our perception of what our truth is, our lives, and our realities?
Well, I would say that was to unpack that question. That was a lot there. The first, I'd say, what we have to remember is World War I and
Yes.
World War II were dramatic events in Western culture. World War I in particular was the moment when especially Europeans, and Europeans still have a great influence on our thinking, realized that the old order did not have the answers. There began to be a questioning of the order, you know, and in fact, World War I was really about replacing the aristocracy with socialism, communism. I mean, it was the old monarchies really. That was when they came to an end there, the old empires. But if we think first about those wars and the failures of the elites that were running the countries to keep order, to keep people alive, to deliver on their promises, lead people to question the order, to question how things have been for hundreds of years. In the United States, we see some of that same questioning. It's always going on, but really bubbling up after World War II, in part because European thought and the disaffection and the alienation that they have. Also, if you think about the Cold War, so we are having a Cold War with the Soviet Union. We are promoting ourselves as the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we've got Jim Crow laws. We've got women. My mother couldn't sign a lease without her father signing it. Okay, so we had a lot of impediments to our citizens, and I think that the assault on authority gave people the authority, you know, emboldened them to say, why are things like this? What we're having now is not only do you have all of these groups, all of them, you know, demanding their place at the table, but in addition to the people we have here, whether it's with women, gays and lesbians, transgender community, minority groups, is this huge waves of immigration. I mean, in 1965, 5.7% of the United States population was immigrants or their descendants. It's now 13%, and it's expected to go to about 20% in 2050. Okay, 20% of the United States population, immigrants or foreign-born. What does that mean? That means that the question of identity, which is the central question of literature, who am I? How do I relate to those around me and the world around me, is the question. And that's why we see time and time again, literature is increasingly interested in questions of identity. And what's great about literature is that as we increasingly are surrounded by people who are different than we are, who come from different cultural backgrounds, who have different beliefs, values, and assumptions, we need to make a greater effort to say, I know that everybody doesn't think the way I do or understand the world the way I do. Who are they? How do they understand the world? Why do things make sense to them that do not make sense to me? And literature is one of the great opportunities that we have in history to enter the minds of other people. It's like a dress rehearsal for when we go out into the world. It reminds us of difference. And that difference is something that, and you see what's going on with Europe now, with the huge migrant populations, all the people leaving Syria and Iraq and Nigeria, and they're all moving to Germany. I mean, this is a tremendous challenge, and it is not easy, and it's going to intensify as people from far-flung corners who are kind of stuck in their old countries can leave. And so books, I think in particular, are one of the few places where we can, apart from face-to-face, which is the most important thing, but where we can really enter the mind of somebody else, where we can practice empathy, which is going to be one of the great skills that, you know, my children at least are going to need. This will only be gaining steam by the time I check out.
So with that said, how do we draw people to books, to written works, to literature that not only helps us to appreciate and understand, as you talked about World War I, World War II, the Cold War, now fast forward into the 21st century, you know, how do we draw people to take the time to go to the places where the, you know, the books are, whether it's the library or whether it's on your what's that electronic thing that we have now, Kindle, thank you. Whether it's on the Kindle, to get this information, to get this understanding of not devaluing someone's culture or choices or values or traditions, but gaining a understanding of those cultures, those traditions, and or those whatever we choose to identify with, because we live in a society that's very judgmental. The foundation of this country was built on one, you know, one thing, and now there's a mass movement of just away from that and dealing with the self-identity, please. Who I am, this is who I am, this is who I want to be, this is how I want to live, this is my life. And it may not align with some of the value system that I've been taught, but it's the choice I'm making.
Well, I think that, you know, this gets back to the whole lack of curiosity column, because the paradox here, the rub, is that on the one hand, the world is changing. And a certain group of people does not speak for everybody. The whole question of what's universal, except maybe the quest for freedom and self-determination, yeah, you know, I think are sort of universal, and everybody's love for the iPhone. But other than that, what's really universal? So one of the reasons that we don't get people to read, that makes it difficult, is that this assault on authority also meant that we don't stigmatize people in the way we used to for not knowing things. When I was younger, you know, you would not admit that you didn't read the newspaper. You certainly wouldn't brag about it. I can't tell you how many people I know go, oh, I don't read the newspaper. And it's like, okay, I admit newspapers aren't quite as good as they used to be, but to me it's like, so you're just saying, well, you know, I don't care about my community or knowing what's going on. People are happy to say, oh, I don't read books anymore. So there used to be a stigma attached to that, and stigma can be very negative, but it can also have some positive things. It's like voting, you know, so you can vote or not vote. You need to somehow make people feel guilty, and I don't know how you do it, for not voting, for not participating, for not being part of that social pressure is extremely important. And yet we've seen, from whether or not you work, whether you have out of wedlock children, whether, I mean, a whole range of things that had been stigmatized and that had some negative implications to it. But if you also have a society where anything goes, where it's okay for people to do sex tapes of themselves, that's how Kim Kardashian, you know, you don't have that control. There's a price for that as well. And I don't know how to square that. I'd say the other thing is that reading becomes difficult because people constantly, even though the world is becoming more diverse, they want to read about themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard for literature to tell you what's really going on, which is you need to read about Iranians who, you know, have moved to India before settling in Kentucky. I mean, those are the real, to me, the Americans in some way, people like me and you perhaps, are at a real disadvantage because we're basically in the place where, one of the places where people want to come to. The story of our time is not the person who's born in New York and moves to Raleigh. The story of our time is the cab driver I had in New York City who was born in India, moved to Dubai, moved to Kentucky where he married a local woman before moving to Toronto and then settling in New York for now to drive a cab. That's the guy who is the story of the 21st century. And literature, on the one hand, can help us learn those stories, this velocity of movement of people. On the other hand, people like to read about themselves, and it's increasingly hard to find yourself in books, especially books that everybody's reading, because the story is so multifaceted.
Yes. And so I guess that leads me to the next section, really truth and truthiness. We know it, but we can't prove it. And I want to talk a little bit about one, because you open this column with quote, conventional wisdom says we live in the age of information, but increasingly it seems that ours is an era of misinformation. And if you read further down in the column, it talks about the era of misinformation has arisen from a desire for truth. And now we see that, you know, people are writing books, they're self-publishing. If they can't find it in a book, they're writing their own book. And now the onset of the blog. The blog is now become a major thing on the internet where people are just writing about any and everything under the sun. You can find it through a blog. And, you know, and so now people are finding new ways to express themselves or express their beliefs in places where they couldn't do it traditionally. Whether it be mainstream media, whether it be the newspaper. So now, you know, how do we put that together with, you know, an age of information? We have everybody out there spouting about whatever they're talking about, to get to really, you know, where lies the truth in, you know, some of this stuff, or how do we get there to really be educated and be informed?
Well, I think that, again, it's an incredibly exciting time. When you think about this mass movement of people across the globe, that's incredible. When you think about social media, Twitter, Facebook, blogs, the opportunity for people to express themselves. In a sense, everybody, this is another part of the assault on authority. It used to be that the person who owned the printing press got to set the agenda to a great extent. Now everybody has a printing press. And to the extent that you can attract an audience, I mean, I would say that the Black Lives Movement, for instance, it's hard to imagine the velocity of that movement's rise in the consciousness of this country without social media. You think how long it took the civil rights movement, Dr. King, I mean, even before King, but I mean, it was decades of hard work and local organization and lots of people doing the work that you now can raise the profile of claims very quickly if they resonate with people because of social media. I think one of the challenges, and I'll take another great example of this, is Ta-Nehisi Coates has a new book out, the African-American writer. He writes for the Atlantic Monthly, and he has a book out called Between the World and Me, which is a memoir that he wrote about growing up in Baltimore, and there was violence on the streets and so forth. And his basic idea is that American society is committed to the destruction of the black body. That's what he's saying. It's an extremely controversial point of view. But if you read his book, not as a history, but as a memoir, this is his point of view. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's how he sees the world. There is no truth. There is no truth except right, death, and taxes, right? Except for that, there's viewpoints. It's different ways that people have of looking at the world. And I think one of the things that one of the reasons that we have such bitter politics now is that people are, I'm not saying there aren't better answers than others, but they're committed to this old idea that there is truth, and the even older idea that they possess the truth, when in fact what there are viewpoints that need to be navigated and understood. You and I are going to have a fruitful conversation if I say, you've got something to, and this is what I think is what's great about literature, because literature is saying somebody else knows something I don't know. They've got a perspective that I don't have. And I am going to give my time over to that person, not to get the truth of whatever, but hear what they have to say. People have things to share with me.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that gives us, you know, a deeper appreciation and going back to getting understanding. I know one of the things you mentioned about in a journalist in reporting or being a reporter where you're gathering facts. And sometimes, you know, facts can be on, you know, scientific information. Water is wet. That's a fact. But then in certain situations or certain scenarios, as you're out there and as you're talking with people, and especially now, because we have in our face a lot of what is going on in America, in the communities, you know, in Ferguson, in Baltimore, you know, the young man in Florida, you know, all of those things are happening, and the outrage and the outburst of people now who are just coming forth and speaking forth or seeking justice in those different, and everybody has their perception of what it means to them, what they saw with the visual eye, what their truth is in that. And then, you know, now looking through the eyes of the justice system and saying, you know, we want justice because this is what we've seen. And in some instances, being told, well, you may have visually seen that, but that you didn't see what you thought you saw. And I think that you know, just living that life and living through that time now, and I'm just looking at this revolution of how this Black Lives Matter has come to the forefront. Even the Confederate flag. I mean, with South Carolina, that has been a, you know, a major thing through the death of, you know, people getting shot in a church, and that now coming to, how did we get from the death of the people in the church, of the young men killing the people in the church, to now a whole thing about the Confederate flag and the removal of that flag. I mean, it's, you know, every day, you know, as I sit and I watch the news and flick between all the different channels, I am in utter amazement of how these events are happening and triggering a series of other things that are driving a major change in this country. It's really unbelievable. And, you know, going back to the conversation about our young people and the lack of curiosity, because I think that in some points they really don't have an understanding or an appreciation, or aren't really able to connect the dots in terms of the history. And therefore, you know, if we understand the history as it has been written and passed down through traditions of what that has meant to different people. And there's two sides to everything. There are people that have an appreciation for the Confederate flag because it represents a time in the South of a history that was a good history, that was an economic time for them. But there's also another group of people on the flip side of that that said, yes, but that the spurring of the Southern economy was boomed on the backs of my people and my ancestors. And so we have arguments on both sides of the table with that. And it's just, you know, coming at us each and every day. And I'm going to wrap up with this, because you're writing on politics and culture through your bi-weekly column. How do you like sift down to determine, you know, what is going to be the next thing that I'm going to talk about or write about through my column? How do you make that determination?
Right. Well, and I would say this is where books really, one of the things that I try to do is, what can I bring to the table that other people aren't, or that I don't see? And I think one of the things that books, there's a good concept called, there's communication and there's meta communication. So there's communication, you and I having a conversation, and then there's how are we communicating? And a lot of times what literature gets us into is, what are the larger forces and issues framing our discussions? So if two people just get into a fight about the Confederate flag, without saying, well, one, how are we talking about this? And here's a symbol that has for years flown on the dome of the Capitol. Mm-hmm. So that's basically saying, I'm going to privilege one way of viewing the flag over another. So one of my questions was, and I wrote a column about the Confederate flag, was, I understand that you see this as a symbol of heritage, and other people see it as a symbol of hate. But one thing you have to fess up to is the fact that your way of viewing the flag has been the one that society has endorsed, and that's why it's flying on top of that Capitol. So I understand your sense of loss that they're taking it down, but you have to understand, for all of those years that you got your way, you got to define that symbol, somebody else didn't get their way. The loss that you're feeling now is the loss that other people have felt for a long time. And so part of what, books in particular, they give us that history, okay, which I think is really important. If you don't know the Confederate flag, if you don't, for instance, know that the Confederate flag was first flown above the South Carolina State House in the early 1960s, wasn't in the 1860s, it was in the 1960s. It wasn't as racial heritage, it was a resistance to desegregation. Then you can't really view that properly. I think that a lot of what our discussions are about, that rather literature reminds us about, is this idea of different perspectives. Literature is all about perspective and identity. And I think our body politic would be much healthier if we didn't just see our own point of view that we're trying to force on other people. If we were also aware, to be honest too, not to go too far off here, but one of the things that's happened in intellectual thought in the last 40 years is this idea that language, it defines things, okay? And so that if we can get people to use our language by any means necessary, then we can win debates. And so we get away from truth because language just seems to be a tool not to describe things accurately, but to win political arguments. And so one of the things that literature allows us to do is to say, how are we talking about things, reminding us about that, whose perspective is being privileged in this instance, and how does that make room for other people? And I think that going forward, what we're going to, the reason that I like to read is that I think it gives a background and a perspective to understand what is going on today, to understand ideas of truth, identity, and so forth. How we get people to do that, I don't know, to be honest. And if I did, I would be a millionaire. I'd have a publishing house. But I think discussions like this, I think having people like you bringing people on, the more that we talk about these things, make things available, make the case for literature, for history to people, the better off we'll be than if we all just surrender and go back to our own little rooms and read our books and say, I don't just have to be a private intellectual. I think, like you, we also have to be public intellectuals.
I promise people I would tell them where they can find you, number one. So why don't you tell them your website?
So I have a website, www.top10books.net. So that's www.toptenbooks.net, which is based on another book that I did that's got favorite books of great authors. And it's a terrific website. I recommend that all of your readers go there to get suggestions about what to read next. Oprah Winfrey's got nice choices. Don Imus has nice choices. Your book club person has nice choices. But these are 170 of the world's greatest writers telling you what they think is worth reading. And you.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure that we have that up on our screen for those of you who may be listening or viewing and didn't grab that. And we'll also have it available on my Facebook page, and we can tweet that for you as well. In addition, this